One of the biggest socio-political topics in recent years has been the emerging Gen Z gender divide. Data from recent elections across several Western democracies, including the US, UK, Germany and South Korea, highlights this trend, with young women increasingly turning to left-wing political parties and young men continuing to vote for the right. So in this video, we'll explore the UK's Gen Z gender divide, and why, despite most media reports implying the gap is due to young men's rejection of feminism or gendered social media echo chambers, there's at least some data suggesting the reasons for the divide may be more economic than social. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. We'll start with a quick summary of the relevant research. In early 2024, Dr. Alice Evans, a senior researcher at King's College London, and the Financial Times' data analyst John Byrne-Murdoch simultaneously published two pieces on gendered ideological polarisation, finding that young women across Western democracies are becoming more liberal compared to young men. This was then picked up by other media outlets, including TLDR News, with reports often focusing on the apparent backlash against feminism driven by male influencers like Andrew Tate, or the difference in media consumption between young men and women. In the UK, recent surveys do suggest a growing divergence in attitudes towards gender equality between young men and women. A March 2025 Ipsos KCL study found that Gen Z men and women are more divided than any other generation on attitudes towards feminism and gender roles, with 60% of British Gen Z men, compared to 38% of Gen Z women, believing that men are expected to do too much to support equality, and 57% of Gen Z men, compared to 36% of Gen Z women, believing that we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men. Perhaps surprisingly, Gen Z men are also the most likely to agree with the statement, "A man who stays at home to look after his children is less of a man," with 28% agreeing compared to 19% of women. When we look at voting patterns, we see that over the past 2 decades, women appear to have shifted towards more socially progressive parties, while men remain about as conservative as they've historically been. For context, throughout most of the 20th century, according to the National Centre for Social Research, British women were marginally more right-wing than men, due to higher religiosity and lower exposure to left-wing institutions like trade unions. However, as gender roles shifted and newer generations of women moved into education and employment, their party support shifted to the left. But thinking about Gen Z specifically, what's driving the gender divide in the UK? Well, there's at least some evidence to suggest that the main cause of this divide in the UK is economic, rather than social. As we've mentioned, many articles ascribe the gender divide to a backlash against feminism among young men, and to algorithms pushing gendered content. But it's possible instead to view the Gen Z gender divide as at least partly a consequence of the economic crisis currently facing young people in the UK, which arguably began under austerity measures in the 2010s, and which has been worsened by Brexit, the pandemic, and the energy crisis in recent years. To support this idea, let's take a look at this 2019 LSE blog post on austerity and the gender age gap. These tables show that, in 2015 and 2017, both UK general election years, women were more likely than men to say that their living standards, household financial situation, the general economic situation, and the NHS had got worse, or would get worse in the next year. Moreover, younger women, aged under 35, were consistently more likely than older women, aged 35 to 64 or 65 plus, to think that their economic situation had got worse, or would get worse. Specifically, in 2017, young women were 23 points more likely than young men to think that the general economic situation would get worse over the next year. This pessimism wasn't especially surprising, given previous research indicating the disproportionate impact of austerity measures on women, who are generally more reliant than men on state services, welfare payments, and are more likely to work in the public sector. What's interesting, though, is how this translated into voting patterns. The study showed that, at both the 2015 and 2017 elections, young women were significantly more likely to vote Labour and less likely to vote Conservative than young men, with this roughly mapping onto under 35s. Meanwhile, there was little difference between women's and men's voting choice above 35, suggesting that young women's economic pessimism was associated with a greater likelihood of voting Labour, with its anti-austerity policies. Looking at the 2019 and 2024 general elections, again we see a stark difference in voting trends between young men and women. At the 2019 election, while there was only a small gender gap overall, there was a notable gender gap between young men and women, with 65% of 18 to 24-year-old women compared to 46% of 18 to 24-year-old men voting Labour, while roughly twice the share of young men compared to young women voted Conservative. Then, in 2024, while roughly the same share of young men and young women voted for Labour or the Lib Dems, almost twice the share of young women to young men voted for the socially left-wing anti-austerity Greens, 23% to 12%, while double the share of young men compared to young women voted for the right-wing parties Reform UK or the Conservatives. Meanwhile, surveys continue to show that young women in the UK are the most pessimistic about the future of the economy. An Ipsos survey from 2023 found that young women aged 18 to 34 were 18 points more likely than young men to think the general economic situation would get worse in the next year, while young people overall were more pessimistic than older age groups. Bearing in mind the earlier study on the correlation between young women's economic pessimism and voting patterns, this again suggests that young women will increasingly turn to more left-wing, possibly populist parties that offer anti-austerity policies. More broadly though, research suggests that when faced with economic insecurity, people are more likely to vote for populist parties, which probably explains why more young men voted for reform than the Conservatives in 2024. Now, before we conclude, we should also say that algorithms and gendered narratives on social media almost certainly contribute to ideological polarisation between Gen Z men and women too. However, this social polarisation is more likely a symptom of the broader economic crisis facing Gen Z, which breeds anger, resentment, and zero-sum thinking, i.e. the idea that if one group succeeds, then another loses out, all of which then gets amplified by social media. Ultimately, Gen Z men and women probably have more struggles in common than they have differences, from the cost of living crisis to housing unaffordability. To prevent the gender divide from widening, with potentially severe impacts for fertility rates and the future workforce, the government needs to address the economic crisis facing Gen Z and millennials, or things will only get worse. Everything we've discussed in today's video plays into a broader sense of uncertainty in the world at the moment. And who's so often in the middle of all that? Well, the United States. So in the next issue of our magazine Too Long, we're discussing this geopolitical shift, and whether we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section, we discuss everything from the collapse of democratic norms in the US to the decline in American soft power, to issues with the US economy or the battle for universities, before discussing who could potentially take over in a post-America world. So if you want to find out what we really think, now's your chance. It's not just the US though. This issue is our longest ever at 78 pages, full of our very best journalism and analysis. So we also get into why Germany's military might is growing, if Farage could become the UK's Prime Minister, why countries are outsourcing their migrants, why the global order is collapsing with Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, and why leaders like Putin and Netanyahu seem to be getting away with it. The magazine has now been officially published, so if you order a copy today, we'll ship it to you as soon as we can. Or if you select the digital edition, we'll send a digital version of Too Long straight to your inbox. Plus, if you want the best deal, make sure that you subscribe to Too Long. That way, not only do you get every issue going forward, you'll also get 20% off every copy as long as you're a member. On top of that, this week only, if you use code LASTCHANCE20, you'll get an additional 20% off this copy, bringing down the cost from £9.99 to £6.40 for a digital edition, or £13.99 to £8.96 for a physical edition. This really is your last chance too. From next week, all new subscribers won't receive this issue of Too Long, instead having to wait until December's The New Middle East issue. So if you want the reduced subscriber pricing on this issue, this really is your last chance. As we outlined in our recent video on TLDR's finances, TLDR actually made a loss last year, and Too Long is a big part of our plan to make TLDR profitable in 2025 to continue funding the free videos we release every day. So if you want to be part of that, then head to toolong.news and subscribe today. We really appreciate your support.